Everyone, and welcome to this presentation. My name is Mike Emery. I'm the acting site administrator of the Cornwall Iron Furnace, a historic site which is owned and operated by the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, Pennsylvania State Agency for History. Our lecture tonight, The Curious Life of James Coleman Drayton by Jim Polczynski, is brought to you by the Cornwall Iron Furnace Associates, a nonprofit support group that is made up of volunteers from the community. Our lecture tonight will be a hybrid consisting of people in the room here in Cornwall Manor and people at home watching on their computers. For those of you attending in person, we will gladly take your questions at the end of this presentation. For those of you on Zoom, please send your questions using the Q&A button, and we will address your questions at the end of the presentation as well. We're also recording this evening's lecture, and we'll place it on the museum's YouTube channel in the near future. I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Jim Polczynski. Jim has worked as a consulting knowledge engineer for various steel companies, including Bethlehem Steel, Lukens Steel, Dofasco Steel, and Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel. He developed an interest in the iron and steel industry in Lebanon and Cornwall while renovating and restoring the Cornwall Company Store. He is the author of Souls of Iron, which tells the remarkable story of the Coleman Iron Dynasty. Jim is also the president of the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace, so please welcome our speaker this evening, Jim Polczynski.
All right, thank you. We'll actually see if you applaud at the end, right? But I really appreciate the fact you all came out tonight. This will be maybe a little bit different type of a talk. Normally we talk about how the iron was made or how the ore was mined, or maybe one of the individuals who was primarily involved in the making of the iron, or anything like that. But this is actually what I'm going to call a fringe Coleman descendant that we don't know a lot about. Maybe you all know a lot about, but at one point in time, I was very surprised to find him in some of the letters that I had researched. But all of his obituaries, James Coleman Drayton, talk about him as being a quiet man who liked, to be in private and remote and reclusive. Well, he sure led an interesting life that wasn't so quiet or reclusive, as we'll get into during the talk. But if you look at the title, Scandal, Identity Theft, and Infectious Disease, doesn't that sound like a subtitle or a byline that could apply to something that happened recently? But no, our story is going back over 100 years ago. It's going to be covering time period of in the 1890s, basically up through the early 1900s. And so onward. Okay, now which button? Right or left?
Right.
Oh, my. I'm used to using a mouse. That's why I'm just... I need his mastery here. Oh. Is that
Maybe. Say, I told you, this is great when this stuff works.
so? It's not just me.
No, it's not, it's just him. There we go.
Okay, great. Has anybody in the room watched The Gilded Age? A few of you. Have anybody in the room watched Downton Abbey? Oh, a lot more hands there. So Julian Fellowes was the creator of Downton Abbey, and it ran for a number of seasons. The Gilded Age, also created by Julian Fellowes, who is an Englishman, decided that he wanted to produce a series based on the Gilded Age. And the original series started with the idea of looking at the contrast and the relationships between the old money society and the new money. And basically the families of the Van Ryans, which is the woman in the front who's staring at you like, I don't like you. Her, Bransky or something like that, right? We've seen her in a lot of shows. And to her To her right would be her sister, and she features prominently, and you might know her more from Sex and the City, another HBO show. On the left are the Russells. They're the new money. And I love the fact, I'm originally from Pittsburgh, and I love the fact that George Russell is basically from Pittsburgh. And so that you have this conflict. But in the third season, which is the one that just finished a month or so ago, they talked a lot about relationships, and they talked a lot about divorce. And that was an ongoing theme. But if you haven't watched The Gilded Age, it's really worth watching. It's the production is amazing. I don't know how much they've spent on the costumes and the settings, but it's really an elaborate show. And in my opinion, it's very entertaining. And it does bring out some of the central issues that were present during the Gilded Age, the period basically after the Civil War, prior to World War I. And I think the fact that you're all here, I'm going to make the assumption you like history. Otherwise, you might not be here. So that's my assumption. Don't prove me wrong. So I say as heard in, because James Coleman Drayton is not portrayed in the Gilded Age as a character in the show. He's only ever mentioned. And so I don't know if it was the fourth episode or what it was that I'm sitting there watching, and all of a sudden they talk about James Coleman Drayton. And it's like, I perked up. And actually my wife constantly will get me interested in something by, she'll be reading something and pretend, oh, Robert Coleman. And it's like, and it's just to see if I'm listening, I think. And so he is featured as a character, but not portrayed as a actual character in the Gilded Age numerous times throughout many episodes. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at primarily his life, because all he got was mentioned verbally. And I don't think that's fair to a Coleman descendant that happened. So we're going to give him some justice tonight and talk a little bit more about his life. And we're going to do it in 4 parts. First part is we're going to talk about who is in the Coleman line. How is he descended from Robert Coleman? Number 1. Number 2, we're going to talk about whatever this scandal is. And if you were just listening to what I said about divorce, I'm thinking that maybe the scandal has something to do with divorce. Third, we're going to talk about identity theft, and we're going to look at what identity theft meant back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's a little different today. You got to be absolutely careful what you press on when you get a text message. And it's like very scary sometimes about what you can click on and what you can't. But the effects of identity theft in James Coleman Drayton's life was probably worse than anything maybe we've experienced in this room. And then finally, we're going to talk about the infectious disease connection, and I'll leave that for a little surprise ongoing. And page, I didn't do it. Okay, nope, it's showing here. What am I doing wrong? So I don't do it over and over and over again.
That's a good question.
Maybe just click on the slide. Nope.
Nope, that's not doing it.
Apologize for the delay here.
Try another one here.
Okay, so what do I need to do moving forward?
I think you should just be good now.
Okay, great. Hopefully we've resolved that. Thank you for your patience. My apologies. So where James Coleman Drayton fits in is he is descended from the line of James Coleman. How many of you have been to Elizabeth Furnace? a few of you. You know where it is, right? Just down there in Burkerville. And Robert Coleman, actually, that's where he lived until he retired from the iron industry and moved to Lancaster. James Coleman was born at Elizabeth Furnace and he died at Elizabeth Furnace. That was his home. He and Harriet Dawson had 5 children, 2 boys, 3 girls. And these are the children. So Robert Coleman, not the Robert Coleman that we know from Cornwall, but the Robert Coleman, obviously the son of James, brother of George Dawson Coleman, and that name might be familiar. George Dawson Coleman, we associate that with Coleman Memorial Park. But those were the 2 sons, and the daughters were Anne. They called her Anna, Sarah, and Harriet, and they also referred to her as Hattie. Robert and George Dawson Coleman built the first anthracite furnaces in the county of Lebanon, and they had inherited 3096 worth of the ore pit. So that's how much they had of the ore pit. So Robert had 15, and this will, at the very end of this talk, I'm going to quiz you to see if you remember these numbers, because I'm going to bring it up again. So they had 3096. This might not seem like a lot, but when we get to 1918, it'll actually amaze you how much it could have been worth. I don't know that anybody really saw it at that time in the early 1800s. They bought out their sisters. So the will of James Coleman left all their share in the operations of the iron and their share in the ore. They left it equally to the 5 children. So Robert and George bought the shares of their sisters for $244,000 back in 1840 dollars. So that's quite a lot more money. I don't have the calculation right in my head. And that'll become interesting because Sarah, Harriet, and Anna all had their own money, which not necessarily was a common thing back at the time period. And actually, Anna's first husband, signed a prenuptial, essentially saying that he would never touch her money. There was always a thing with wealthy people in the 1800s, was that they were always concerned that the women would get, they'd have male suitors just for the money instead of for love. This is a portrait, and it's still in the family. It's a private collection of Anna and Harriet, not Sarah. And this is Thomas Solly, famous Philadelphia artist. He also painted the Cornwall branch of the family. Sarah's not pictured here, but okay, I'm stuck again. Gosh, sorry, Mike. I'm just pressing a button. I'm just an automaton. Let's try this. I can handle that. All right. Okay. So Sarah, now this is interesting because Robert Coleman, the first Robert Coleman, he granted the right to someone to marry his daughter Elizabeth, and then that guy's brother came and he wanted to marry Margaret, who was also a daughter of Robert Coleman, and Robert Coleman said, "That's never going to happen in my family." Well, it didn't take very long until the 3rd generation that 2 Drayton brothers married 2 Coleman sisters. And these are older pictures. This is not how handsome they looked when they were younger. But Henry Edward Drayton on the right and William Hayward Drayton on the left. And they were from South Carolina. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Drayton Hall in South Carolina, but it's along the Ashley River outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. And this is the only home in America that has a no-fly zone over the home, because the molding of the ceiling is so fragile that it would probably get disturbed if an aircraft flew over. So it has a no-fly zone. And it's got these live oak trees with the Spanish moss, in the yard. It's just an incredible property. And it is basically very stark, if you will. It's not a fancy mansion to tour, but it has a very incredible history. Well, the Drayton brothers, their grandfather owned a part of Drayton Hall. But he decided he was going to try to make his fortunes in Florida as like a kind of a governor for the British, because the British were really concerned about the Spanish, in Florida, and they wanted to make sure that they just stayed where they were and didn't try to, advance into the colonies, because this is before the Revolutionary War. And so he sold his share in Drayton Hall, and he left to go seek his fortunes in Florida. And it didn't really work out so well as things approached the Revolutionary War. Everything he was trying to accomplish in Florida really didn't work out so well for him financially. But he ended up in South Carolina. And his son left South Carolina over something they called the nullification crisis. Basically, the North had, here's a nice word we all love, the North had imposed a tariff that the South didn't like. And South Carolina basically said, hey, we're going to withdraw from the Union if you go through with this tariff. Well, they did back off from the tariffs. The nullification crisis was resolved, but William Drayton moved to Philadelphia anyhow. And he took with him his two sons. They both fell in love with the Coleman daughters. And so that they're happy and all that. James Coleman Drayton is the only son that was born to Sarah and Henry Drayton. She died shortly after childbirth, so it was the only son. So put that on the shelf for right now. Now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk to what might seem unrelated. We're going to talk about Anna, the one daughter from the painting. I think she actually looked better in the Thomas Sawley painting than here, but this was a common hairstyle that often was worn during that time period. And she married Charles Parker. Charles Parker is a gentleman I referred to that actually pretty much signed a prenuptial and said to Harriet, Anna's mother, I won't touch your money. Don't worry about it. And he actually had his own property, and he was a doctor, but he had his own money and he was pretty well off. Unfortunately, he died young. And Anna was deeply hurt. She deeply loved him. And there was another doctor that knew her husband that had, died. And he comforted her, and he actually, attended to her physical stress. And his name was Dr. Edward Peace. Well, everything was great until they started to have feelings for one another. And I mean, you can imagine how that happens. The problem with Dr. Edward Peace was he was divorced. So here's the beginning of a divorce theme in the talk. Not only was he divorced, he was divorced to a woman who was still alive. And that was real bad. That just didn't happen in society. It was so much so that it upset all of Philadelphia society. And basically, Anna's family disowned her. And there were some choice words that some of the members of the family threw around, like comparing Anna to a prostitute, all because she fell in love with a man who was divorced, whose wife was still living. You maybe can't imagine the mindset, but during that time period, it was ingrained, especially in society, right? Because that's where our best qualities are supposed to surface in society. That's the best that mankind can attain to. So they just moved along. She married Dr. Edward Peace. And actually, they lived very happily and had a great love for one another. And she cried in a letter to her mother saying, what's wrong with me? I found someone I can love. I never thought I could do that again. What's wrong with that? But it didn't matter. It was just she was cut off. Now, this was okay for little James Coleman Drayton until 1862, when his father passed away. So his mother passed away shortly after childbirth, and his dad dies in 1862. And the interesting thing is, when the will was read, when Henry Drayton's will was read, George Dawson Coleman wrote a letter to William Henry's brother and said, "You won't believe," I'm paraphrasing, "you won't believe what I just heard at the reading of his will. I don't think we're going to like any of the options." So he basically said there are three potential people that could become guardians for James Coleman Drayton. One was Henry's second wife, Mary. Family didn't like her. And his brother, Percival, who was still in the South, and he was a single man, and he said no. Mary said no. The third person was Anna Parker Peace. This just freaked out the family. They were just irate. They tried to do everything they could to stop the guardianship, but the courts upheld Anna's guardianship. And so James Coleman Drayton, at the age of 10, went to live with the Peaces. And Anna and Edward Peace had 5 other children. And James Coleman Drayton actually remained close to those children and even left money in his will to them. So he basically doesn't have much contact with the rest of the family, though. Not because they didn't want it, but because tensions were just so very rough. So that's what we're leaving James Coleman Drayton at the age of 10 here. He's living with the Peaces. He's basically pretty happy. When he's 21, he goes to Princeton. He receives a degree from Princeton. He stays for another 3 years. He gets a master's degree. He becomes a lawyer. He passes the bar in New York, and he becomes basically a corporate lawyer. He is listed as a president of one early probiotics company from the 1800s. It's like he's listed as president because I think the company needed to have somebody from the corporate side. He's a trustee of many other companies, but mostly he's practicing corporate law. I have not found, and I maybe need to do more research, but I haven't found any instances where it says he was a banker. He definitely was involved as a trustee with numerous institutions, some financial, but I've not found that he was actually a banker. But yet every single obituary you will find of James Coleman Drayton says banker. And of course they mentioned the scandal that we're now going to get to. All right. Just as a summary, this kind of summarizes the people I've been talking about, from James Coleman and Harriet on down through their 5 children. And you can see that all the way down to James Coleman Drayton. And then, his marriage to an Astor, Charlotte Augusta Astor. Does anybody know that name? We certainly all know the name of John Jacob Astor, right? At this point in time, one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest person in the country. Now, if you really want to know more about the Draytons, I don't have the time to do it tonight, but this book is pretty well written and worth reading if you're interested in the history of the Draytons. It's simply titled William Henry Drayton. And he's actually the guy who basically left his shares and went to seek his fortune in Florida. But it's pretty good reading if you like that kind of thing. I mean, I don't know how many of you read history or you are interested, but if you read history, and if you forget, you can just ask Mike how to reach me, and I'll tell you how to get it. So now back to the Gilded Age. William Backhouse Astor Jr. was the grandson of John Jacob Astor, and he basically at that point embodied most of the wealth of the family. He married the woman that you see on, that is your right over there, right? Yes. This is your left, that's your right. That's your right over there? No, that's your left. Okay, on your far left is a portrait of the Mrs. Astor, and she's portrayed in the Gilded Age as it's a complex portrayal. They show a human side of her where she really does care about, her place in society, and she actually cares for some other people in society and their plight. And then at other times, she doesn't seem to care at all about what happens to anybody, and that she's really just out for herself. And I think she was that kind of a complex woman. And I think that the series does try to draw that out. As to the casting, you can decide the portrait to the woman in the show. I don't know. Do you see any similarity? I see a little bit. I do think that the woman in the show maybe is a little more glamorous than the Mrs. Astor. Now that's her daughter Charlotte on the left. Did I get that right? I'm trying to turn around. There we go. On the right. On the right. The portrait is by James Ferris. There is actually, I don't have any photos of her, but the portrait is by James Ferris around the time she was married. She was considered quite the catch, and when she debuted in society, she was considered the one. And I'm not sure if they really, divorced themselves from the fact, hey, she's also got this super wealthy parents, but she was considered the catch. And that's her portrayed in the show. And if you notice, I tried to find photos that would show the likeness. I thought that they did a good job with the casting, at least, of showing that could be her daughter. Just the way she tilts her head, the way she looks, the kind of smile. It just seemed to me that the caster probably made an extra couple dollars for doing such a great job. So that's Charlotte. Now, she fell in love with supposedly this quiet man, James Coleman Drayton. Apparently, for the first few years, they were quite happy. And William, her father, William Backhouse Astor Jr., actually liked James Coleman Drayton, liked him a lot. And we'll see how that started to show in his behavior later on. This is... There's only sketches of James Coleman Drayton that I have, but this is a sketch of him and her. And they, for all purposes, they were married in 79, all the way up to 1890. They seem to be happy, but Charlotte has this society want to be going to balls all the time and wanting to be dancing, and she wanted the what would be maybe called back then, the high life, if you will. James Coleman Drayton supposedly was quiet and retiring, and it just seemed to be that there might have been a little bit of a conflict between the two. And there's actually a statement, and I'm not sure, I haven't been able to verify it, where she basically said she was very disappointed when she found out how much money he really had, because back then people didn't really know. If you couldn't look up a list, you couldn't go, and find out, well, what are they really worth? And apparently she didn't like the fact that he didn't have as much money as she thought he had. Now, I'm sure he had money. As I mentioned, his mother had $80,000 roughly as a result of being paid by her brothers. That was her money. And I'm sure that, Edward had some money himself, but I'm not sure that he inherited anything close to what the Astors were worth. But bear in mind, William Backhouse Astor liked his son-in-law a whole lot. And he lobbied with Charlotte on his behalf. They started out living in a townhouse in New York City, and that's a photo of it. And then hoping that Charlotte would maybe settle down a little bit, they basically built a mansion for them in Somerville, New Jersey. It was originally called Crow's Foot. It was later named Stronghold by somebody who purchased it after once James Coleman Drayton sold it. The circular portico there, that wasn't original, but the Italiente column, that was original. It's now on the market for $17 million. So if you want to leave right now and go and make a call and put your bid in, please feel free. I won't be upset. It's a heck of a property, and I'm going to show you a couple photos of it. These are from, the 1900s. The columns weren't original, but that fireplace, that was original. These are some outdoor and indoor photos. I mean, this was quite a mansion. And basically, remember that William Backhouse decided, okay, I'm going to build you this mansion over in Somerville, and hopefully my daughter's going to settle down and you guys will just be okay. Because there were already some yeah, a little bit of conflict started because different lifestyles, if you will. Now, unfortunately, they build this mansion in Somerville, New Jersey, and guess what? She ends up having a dalliance with the neighbor. Actually, the neighbor's son. The neighbor was the president of the Equitable Life Insurance Company, and his son was apparently kind of a playboy. Now, I'm looking at his picture down there, and I'm thinking, well, okay, I mean, I don't know. Is he really attractive? But it might just not be a good photo. It was taken years after the supposed dalliance. And I love, and the top picture was from a newspaper of Charlotte, and they're showing her obviously sewing or something like, she's this, person that isn't a party person. And then the other two photos are from the same newspaper article, and we're going to get into what those newspaper articles talked about. And I love the fact that they dressed James Coleman Drayton up to look like Sherlock Holmes, because he actually sent the Pinkertons to do some, spying for him. But he's dressed in this newspaper article like, Sherlock Holmes. And I put a blue triangle there. Why? Why would I put a blue triangle there? Because she's out with him, with Barrow all the time. And James Drayton, he starts to think they're having an affair. And so he wants to get this proved, and he actually sends Alan Parkin, the Pinkerton son, Billy, to go and spy and find out if there really is, an affair going on. Billy says, and I don't know if this was just to please his wealthy patron, but it's Billy says, yeah, they're having an affair. And so James Coleman Drayton gets really, up in it, and he just decides, I'm going to go to London, and I'm going to break this up, and I'm going to challenge Barrow to a duel. And this is a time period where duels didn't even happen in this country, but guess where they were still legal? In Paris. So he goes to London. This is in 1892 in February, and he confronts Barrow, and turns out Barrow is going to Paris next week, and he says, well, I'm going to go to Paris too. And they go to Paris, and they start arranging seconds. Now, apparently, James Coleman Drayton was a really good swordsman, and Barrow is maybe thinking, I don't like this. He also James Coleman Drayton won the Pigeon Shot Award in this country. So he was a good shot, and he was great with a sword. And Barrow is maybe a little bit of a playboy, but he's not really that much of a thinking, I want to have a duel with this guy. So he starts trying to enlist people to find a way out of this duel and still save face. Well, it turns out when James Coleman Drayton first approached Charlotte's parents and basically said, I think she's having an affair, Mrs. Astor, just like in the show, really doesn't want this to get out at all. And so, her husband's going to support her. So they basically offer James Coleman Drayton $5,000 a year for him, $15,000 a year for the kids, the three kids, if he just doesn't seek a divorce. So he's offered this money. Turns out that the two people in Paris that had to decide whether the duel could be fought or not denied the duel based on the fact that Charlotte's parents offered him money. And so they said, you can't have a duel because a duel is supposed to be about honor. And when there's money involved, there's no honor. So they said, no duel. And so James Coleman Drayton kind of just said, oh, okay, great. But he's still upset. So he goes back to London and he boards a ship. Well, it turns out Barrow's on the same ship. Yeah, I mean, you can't write this stuff, right? Now, apparently, according to all newspaper articles, they never, James Coleman Drayton stayed in his stateroom the whole trip on the ocean. And Barrow was out drinking champagne and, having a good old time. Well, they get back to New York, and James Coleman Drayton's anger is not appeased. So he files for divorce on the grounds of adultery, which was kind of unheard of. That just didn't happen in society. What you did is you had abandonment and you had different other issues, but you never would actually sue for adultery, not in society, but he did. Now, it turns out the courts just decided that society was right, and they said there wasn't enough proof. And actually, really, there wasn't any proof. There really was not any hard facts that could prove it. Even though I think William Backhouse Astor Jr. thought there was, because and he died in 1892, the same year that the duel was happening and everything. He had Charlotte in his will for $850,000. $850,000, 1892 money. He left $850,000 to her sisters. She didn't get a penny of it, but he gave $850,000 to her 3 kids to be held in trust with James Coleman Drayton. So she didn't have the money that she thought she was going to inherit. And so she basically, didn't marry Burrough. All that trouble for Burrough and everything, she didn't marry him. She married a very wealthy distiller by the name of Haig. She married him, and actually they stayed married then from that point on. But when she came back to the United States, she was basically snubbed. She tried coming back one time, and society just wasn't going to have it. And actually, this is one thing that the Mrs. Astor remembered the rest of her life. She didn't like, and actually I think the words are, she hated James Coleman Drayton because he actually had people from society side with him, and they didn't go to one of her balls. That was the greatest snub you could do in society. You're invited to a ball. You go to the ball. You don't go. That is like real bad. So James Coleman Drayton had a lot of friends in society who basically boycotted Mrs. Astor's ball. And so she basically had to pick between her popularity, I guess, and she sent her daughter back. And her daughter never came back while her mother was alive to try and make it in society in the United States. So basically her reputation was done over here. She still had a good life in England and stuff, and she's still part of society over there, but her time in society over here was done. Now, in 1894, she was granted a divorce. She countersued James Coleman Drayton for abandonment. And really, there was enough proof of that because he moved out away from her. He didn't have anything to do with her. He severed their active relationship. So, yeah, the court said, yeah, you abandoned her. So the divorce was granted finally in 1896. You think that would be the end of the story, but, we still have a few minutes of the talk, so it's not, right? This guy is an interesting guy. We're going to talk about Oliver Harry Silverberg. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, at the age of 15, his father dies, and he and his brother are left a number of business. His father moved to Oklahoma, and they had a number of stores, and there was some good money there. Well, not for Harry, apparently, Oliver Harry. He went by the name of Harry. He actually started skimming money out of the companies and basically made them bankrupt. He had a desire to be wealthy and to have lots of money to spend on lots of things. He ended up with 7 wives. He just became a con man, and he was really good. He started this in the late 1880s, early 1990s. He had a scheme out in the West where he had a partner, an associate, who worked the telegraph. He would go into a city and he would pretend to have this, he would always have a fake name, and he'd convince the bank that he had credit. Say, go check my credit. The bank would send a telegram to check the bank. Well, it wasn't the bank they were checking with. It was the telegraph operator, was the other part of the scam on the other side. And so that lasted for a little while until the telegraph operator said, I'm out of here, because Harry didn't pay the telegraph offer anywhere near what he was making off of this scam. But it didn't stop him scamming and scheming. But he was in Europe at the time, and this divorce of Charlotte and James Coleman Drayton was in every newspaper in this country, and it was in the newspapers in Europe. And so Harry gets the idea, I'll be James Coleman Drayton, son-in-law of the Astors. How great could that be? I could get money wherever I want. And that's exactly what he did. James Coleman Drayton back in New York starts getting these invoices to the amount of $50,000, which is a lot of money back then. And he's like, I never was there. I never did anything. But here's invoices in my name coming to me to pay. So again, he brings in Billy Pinkerton, and they actually find the fake Jane Coleman Drayton in Chicago. And so, Billy basically says, hey, you better get out of here because we found him. And sure enough, the real James Coleman Drayton confronts him. And you know what Harry does? He doesn't back down. down. He doesn't apologize. He says, oh my God, don't tell anybody. He says, look, if you do anything on to me, I'm going to spread that you are blah, 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 blah. And so James Coleman Drayton said, I don't need that after just going through this, divorce. So he let him go, and they didn't press charges. Well, just a couple years later, he ends up in prison in Minneapolis. He gets caught there. But he gets out of prison right away. He faked tuberculosis. And, it's like, I'm dying. I don't know how he faked it, but, medicine wasn't quite as advanced as it is today. So they let him out. And then he's just like, okay, great. What's my next scheme? And his mother got him out of jail in Mexico. Everywhere he went, it's just scheming and scamming. He just kept using James Coleman Drayton's name. These are all the names that he was known to use. And you can do a search in the newspapers. This guy does not have a book written about him. And I don't know why. And no, I'm not going to. I got a list of a couple others to write. But I think this is just a fascinating story. He was active for over 3 decades. All over the world, Thailand, China, Germany, Mexico. He was just everywhere, and he was just lived a life of scheming and identity theft. So this is the comparison of the two. Do you see the similarity? I mean, maybe there's a little bit, but see, this is before the internet. This is before, you have, photo composition, comparisons and everything. But it actually, people didn't even have a clue. There was no photo of James Coleman Drayton. And there really was no photo of Harry, except that is based on a photo. And that's his signature, that he was forging James Coleman Drayton's name. This was in a newspaper. And then this is a really good photo. Does anybody ever know the name Molly Brown? The unsinkable Molly Brown? Well, that's her and her husband on the left, right? The left. Yes, and that's Harry and one of his wives at that time on the other side of the photo. He had 7 wives. I think I might have mentioned that earlier. These women would just start getting disgusted with him, and he didn't really give them a good share of his schemes. So he was married multiple times, and Harry's working a scheme against Molly Brown, and Molly Brown and her husband were fairly wealthy. They were the top of the top in the elite society of Denver. Now, question for you, and you can feel free to answer. What do John Jacob Astor IV, Harry Silverberg, and Molly Brown all have in common? Yeah, there you go. Winners. You get no prize other than the fact that it's just, you feel good about that, right? So I do want to point out that history is full of little coincidences that we couldn't make up. Ada Lowe Willing Astor. She was descended from Thomas Willing from Philadelphia, super, super, super wealthy, and very involved in our country in its origins. This is the niece of Caroline Willing, who was married to Dr. Edward Peace. She was the wife that was still living that caused so much anxiety. So she was a Willing, and this is her niece, and she marries John Jacob the Astor IV. That's his first wife. And they're all on the Titanic. Jacob Astor IV, he went down, and it's like, I don't know if you saw the movie Titanic by James Cameron, where he's like, and it's all true at the end. He just like a true gentleman went down with the Titanic. Molly Brown survived the Titanic. That's why they call her the unsinkable Molly Brown. And Harry Silverberg was on the Titanic. It was believed he was dead, and James Coleman Drayton could, finally go, great, no more fake IDs or identity theft. But no, he disguised himself as a woman and put a scarf on his head and a coat and everything. He got on one of the boats disguising himself as a woman, and he ends up in Montana, and we thought he was dead. And he pulls another scheme to the tune of $50,000 or so. But that's not the end. Everybody then thought he was done because he actually got, arrested for that, and somehow he got out of jail again. But in 1921, he is in Paris trying to work a deal there. But by that time, they got posters up with his picture on it and everything. And it's like, so he was active for at least 3 decades. He stopped using the name of J. Coleman Drayton, though, after the Titanic, he didn't use J. Coleman Drayton because that dog had no life left in it. It was just, an incredible story of a schemer. If somebody should write it, somebody here should just write it. John Jacob Astor IV, was some material out there say that he gave his sister Charlotte $1 million to make up for the fact that she didn't get noted in her father's will. No, not true. He didn't. He gave her some money, but he didn't give her $1 million. Now, the last one, infectious disease. See, remember from the very beginning? Mary Mallon. Do we know who she is? Typhoid Mary. Guess who she was cook for in 1902? James Coleman Drayton and his family, who all got sick, including the help. They all got sick. This is before they discovered that she was a carrier of typhoid, because she's the first known asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. Eventually, by 1906, they discovered that. They put her into an asylum or whatever for a little while. They let her out, but she then infected people again. But she actually caused the whole, none of the Drayton family members died, but they got very, very ill because she was a cook. And apparently she was a really good cook, and she infected a whole bunch of families, wealthy families, because sometimes a cook, it was Drayton's home in Maine. And, the way the wealthy work, they lived like somewhere for 3 months. They lived somewhere else for 3 months. They lived somewhere else for 3 months. They had multiple homes. And so she was only cooking for the Draytons for 3 months, and then she went on to whatever her next assignment would be. And, it's just that this is a man who, in his obituary, said led a quiet and retiring life. But there is so much noise in the newspapers about his life that it's just, how did he live with that? If he really truly was a retiring, quiet person, how did he really feel inside about all of the press that he got? And basically, you have a couple decades of nothing but his name in the paper. And none of it's because of some great award he got. It's not like the pleasing to have yourself, I guess, talked about that way. Now, he basically ended up retiring to Newport. He loved Newport. He had been there a number of times, and he stayed, and he decided he wanted to live there. So he bought Boxcroft. And Boxcroft was a McKim-Mead and White building, and those are pictures of it. He lived there for the last 9 years of his life. He died in 1934. He had gotten, in November 11th, 1934, he had gotten sick the prior summer. So it's like basically a year and a half he was suffering with illness. And his daughter was with him when he died. His daughter became wife to someone who was very instrumental during World War II with President Roosevelt. And he was part of the peace process, negotiating the final terms of World War II. He really was had quite a career. And so his daughter was very devoted to him. Now, when she got married in London, her mother, Charlotte, did not come to the wedding, but Charlotte, the daughter, actually had visited with the mother the day before, but the mother didn't come to the wedding because she thought it would be too controversial. And I'm thinking also that I can't imagine the tension and the feelings between, Charlotte Augusta Astor and James Coleman Drayton. It had to have been like, no, we don't want that in public. We don't want that in society. And thank you for your time and attendance. I appreciate you being here. You're so kind to give me applause at the end as well. I don't know if it was because I was begging for it in the beginning. I guess we open it up to questions. Anybody have any questions? Any from out in the Wonderland?
I'll ask a question. So, how would you get interested in this particular
Thank you.
And if you repeat that to people.
So the question is, how did I get interested in this particular individual? And it's like I completely forgot about it. So thank you. I don't know if it's because you knew it was in there or you're just like asking because you want to know. Okay, so Mike wants to know, and then all of the other of you want to know, how did I become interested in James Coleman Drayton? So when I was doing research for the book, Souls of Iron, I was going through the minutes of the Cornwall Ore Bank, all the way through to when Bethlehem Steel purchased the ore banks. So I'm going through, and all of a sudden, the next to last meeting of the Cornwall ore banks, which was, dissolved because Bethlehem Steel, got everything, had James Coleman Drayton making a motion that the Cornwall Iron ore banks would be dissolved at the next meeting. And I'm like, well, how did that happen? Because James Coleman Drayton is like a footnote. He's not involved in any of the iron making decisions, any of the ore decisions the entire time it existed. So how did that happen? Well, here's how it happened. Remember, it talks about Robert and George Dawson Coleman and how they sold to their sisters, right? Well, George Dawson Coleman stayed here. He and his brother built the first anthracite furnace, but then Robert wanted to sell his shares just in the anthracite furnaces, not the ore bank, to George, and he moved to Paris. Now, why did he move to Paris? Because he fell in love with a woman by the name of Rosalie Perot, and she was French. And Robert liked France anyhow, so he moved and he lived in France. And actually, it didn't go over so well because she was Catholic. And, none of the Colemans were Catholic, and they were Presbyterian, they were Methodist, and there was a lot of prejudice back then. And so they didn't acknowledge the wedding of Robert and Rosalie. And actually, after Robert died, they contested, saying that there was no marriage. And so Rosalie, not only just grieving the loss of her husband and her son, who had not too long before that committed suicide, she had to go through the agony of trying to prove that, yes, we're married. So she won legal battle after legal battle from Bertrand Dawson Coleman and from one of the, I think, Harriet Drayton. She had to win these battles just to prove she was married. So she actually ended up with 1596 of the ore bank, which at that point in time, it's up in the thousands where the shares are divided. And James Coleman Drayton, he loved France. He had a really close relationship with Rosalie, and she left him 1/3 of what was her 1596 of the ore banks. So he actually inherits what was about $300,000. So that 15 shares that goes way back into the 1800s. That 15 shares translated to $300,000. Just five of those 96 translated to $300. Now you know what $300,000 is basically worth in today's dollars? Anyone can guess? It's over $6 million. It's like almost $6.5 million. So James Coleman Drayton, actually in 1918, then, if he didn't have money before, he had a little bit then. So he could afford Boxcroft in Newport. Did that answer your question, Mike? More than answered your question. Anybody else or anybody from? Yes. No, so Robert and Ann Coleman, the first generation, they had a bunch of kids. And Margaret was one of those children, and she married, and she had a townhouse in Philadelphia, but they also owned the Strawberry Hill Mansion. Yes.
What was James Coleman Drayton's daughter's name?
Okay, it was Caroline, I think.
And her husband?
Her husband, I'm standing up here and I'm trying to remember. I go through these presentations, but I don't go from notes because I like to look at you all because you're all so beautiful. But oh my, it's just not coming. But if you look up James Coleman Drayton on Wikipedia, his daughter's name and her husband will come up. And they used to have dinner with the Roosevelts in Hyde Park, and they were very close friends with them. And, but if you just look it up in Wikipedia, I apologize that I don't have that ready to give to you. Anybody else? Yes. She just looked it up. What was her husband's name? We can resolve this right now through the miracle of the internet. Excellent. Thank you. William Phillips. And you can look him up in Wikipedia, and he's got quite a distinguished resume with the State Department. Anybody else want to read something from Wikipedia? Thank you all so much.
I just wish Jim had a little more enthusiasm about his topics. Well, thank you very much, Jim. That was another great presentation. So, thank you all for joining us for this lecture. I especially want to thank Jim Polczynski for his presentation, and for Kathy Donaldson and Lydia Jones for helping to organize our virtual talk. I also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsored this program, and Cornwall Manor for allowing us to use the space. So please join us for our next lecture on Tuesday, November 11th, so Veterans Day, when Mike Weber will give the lecture OR. That's O-R-E, not O-R, which is a continuation of his series and follows his talks on slag and charcoal. He made slag and charcoal interesting, so just let that be a lesson too. And of course, the museum's next event will be on Saturday, October 25th, when the museum will have evening tours. So just a reminder that the museum is open Friday through Sunday through tours. You may now also, if you're in the room, we are taking donations. There's a little basket in the back if you wish to help us out with these programs. We certainly would appreciate it. But we're also taking donations on the museum's website, cornwallironfurnace.org. Just go into the website, click the support tab, and follow the directions, and you can do it there. So please also check our website for details and additional tour information. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming out tonight, and please stay safe and good night.